Welcome to Healing at the Edge, a podcast featuring interviews, archive talks, and teachings on conscious living, conscious dying with RamDev Dale Borglum, brought to you by the Be Here Now Network. Dale has been a meditation teacher for nearly 50 years and has been at the bedside of the dying and their loved ones for over 40 years. He was the director of the Hanuman Foundation and founded the first Center for Conscious Dying in Santa Fe, New Mexico. He's taught with Stephen Levine, Ram Dass, and countless others on the spiritual path. Dale is still working with the dying today. For more information, please visit livingdying.org.
Welcome, everybody. Hi, this is RamDev Dale Borglum from the Living Dying Project. And today I am really looking forward to just having fun with my old friend, Chris Beaudry from the far north. He's a Living Dying Project member of our board of directors. He's been very, very supportive. Chris is also a farmer up in northern Saskatchewan doing regenerative ag, saving the earth, one loaf of bread at a time. And his friends call him Critter. He thinks we should call him Chris today because we're trying to impress people, so we'll do that. But Critter may be one of the more appropriate nicknames I've ever heard for somebody. And you'll probably figure that out as you get to know Chris Critter a little better. So a number of years ago, maybe 5 years ago, was it in Ojai?
Yeah, 5 years.
Something like 5 years ago. Ram Dass was still alive, but he was staying on Maui. He wasn't really moving around at that point in his life. And there was a Ram Dass legacy retreat in Ojai, California. I was the Dharma teacher. Jai Uttal was the singer. And the theme was compassion. Chris, who I'd never met at that point, he showed up at the retreat. And he can tell you now why he showed up and how he didn't like the advice that I gave him. Okay.
Yeah. So 5 years ago, I showed up. It was in April. I showed up to this retreat in Ojai, and I was there because a year to the day before that, I was a coach of a hockey team in Canada called the Humboldt Broncos. And we were involved in a bus crash where 16 of my players and staff were killed and 13 were injured. 2 had traumatic brain injuries and 2 were paralyzed. After this accident, I didn't know previously that I'd been already on a spiritual journey. I had been sober 4 years to the day when the crash happened. And I didn't really know that I had actually been having some type of spiritual journey while in AA. And shortly after the crash, I was completely lost. I was numb, and I was looking to be fixed. I was looking for some healer, savior, some guru to just come in and touch me on the forehead and say, voila, you're healed. Go live your life and be happy again.
Could I even jump here for a second? I mean, it's a little more dramatic than that. Not only was there's a bus crash, but you were the first person on the scene.
Not the very first. I was one of the first.
One of the first. And you had to identify people that many of them didn't even have faces anymore, that you had to go, and then you had to tell family members what was going on. So it's not just there happened to be a bus crash of people you knew, but you were right there in a very immediate and traumatic way in the immediate aftermath of the crash.
Yes. The coroner, he called me twice and asked me to come back to the scene. And I originally told him I couldn't. And he called again at, I believe it was 3 or 4 in the morning, and said, Chris, we need you to come to the morgue in the morning to identify everyone. You're the only person left on earth who knows all these boys. And yeah, so it's what I ended up doing the next day. I went to the morgue. I was in the hospital. I spent pretty much, other than at funerals, the next month of my life in the ICU, just sitting beside the beds of all my players who survived. And when I wasn't there, I was at, I believe it was 14 funerals in 11 days.
Wow.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, you can imagine the type of pain that a person would be in from that. And I wanted a free way out of it. I was looking for any way to not feel the depth of sadness, the depth of pain that I was in. And I stumbled across Ram Dass one night. I'm a farmer, and it took me until September, till harvest, that it was raining. And I said, you know what? I got to fall asleep to something. And I was flipping through Netflix and I seen this Ram Dass coming home. And I'm like, this seems boring enough to put me to sleep. And I turned it on, and you know what? I fell right asleep. And I thought that would be the end of the Ram Dass Chris Beaudry story. But alas, it wasn't. In the morning, it was still raining, and I was flipping through Audible on my phone looking for a book to listen to. As we're generally working, I like to listen to books. And I said, oh, this Ram Dass fellow has books too. And I downloaded one. I started listening to it, and all of a sudden I was like, this is everything that is happening in my mind and my body. And I listened through Harvest. I think I got through 7 or 8 of his books. I listened to the Bhagavad Gita 3 times. I started going to a Buddhist temple in Saskatoon, my closest city, and I seen this retreat. Like, I better go and check this out. And actually, I had reached out to Raghu because I wanted to go to Maui. And Raghu said, no, you can't come to Maui. It's not for beginners. And I got mad because I always thought so highly of myself. I'm like, beginner? What are you talking about? I've been listening and reading books for 3-4 months now. I'm a super advanced student. But anyway, I end up in Ojai, and I'm with people with all these different names, like Sitaram and Krishna Prem and RamDev and Jayutal. And I'm like, what is this hillbilly farmer doing here? Like, this is so out of my element. But I actually started to not feel frozen anymore. I started to feel something in my heart again. And that started to scare me. And I remember I came up to you and I wanted a direct answer on how to just go back to what I used to feel, go back to how I used to be. And your advice was, Chris, I think you just need to be sad for a while. And again, like with Raghu, that pissed me off. I didn't want to hear that. And so when I got home, I was like, yeah, I'm done with this. Until 2 or 3 other people that I'd been working with suggested that sadness may be the antidote for the pain I was in.
Okay. So one thing I'd also like to set the stage a little bit, that when you say 16 people died and 13 were injured, you were not in a big urban environment where there's a lot of people there. I mean, you lived in a town that had how many people in it?
Well, the closest town to me has 13 people, but the town the hockey team was in has 5,000.
Okay, so it's a really small town. Everybody knows everybody pretty much. So all the fact that 29 people were either injured or killed, almost everybody was affected by that. And then my understanding is that as you began to get into your grief and work with it in a conscious way, people began to ask you to talk about it and share what you had learned. Is that kind of true?
Yeah, actually, very early on, I had my high school reach out to me and ask me to come speak at high school or at the high school grad. And I had barely slept yet. This was only a few weeks after the crash. And I was like, I don't know what to say. I don't know what to say. But I'll do it. And it seemed like things just started to come to me. The words that were coming were not my words. They were, you could call it divine intervention. You could call it a download from source. You can call it whatever you want. But what I found when I was on stage, that something happened. And that led me to create a grief group where for 3.5 years, I ran a weekly group for people to come and share about what their experience is with grief, how they work with it, what they do with it. And it led me to be able to work with mine in such a more embodied way.
So that's great. You say embodied way. And obviously, I come in contact with a lot of people who are grieving too. And often what I suggest is what I call conscious grief work. And the first step of conscious grief work is to feel the grief. Very often when people are grieving, it's so, and I don't ask people to do this 24/7. That would be overwhelming, right? But occasionally, at least, to actually feel in your body what is going on there, not thinking about it, not the story about who died, not if I would have done this, then maybe that. The mind does that. The mind tries to find ways of not touching the hot stove and getting burned, if you will, right? So when a difficult emotion, when any emotion arises, but particularly a difficult one, there's 3 ways to deal with it. Push it away, let me get busy, let me drink, let me turn into type A, busy all the time. Or possibility number 2, get lost in the feeling, become the feeling, not have any space around it. And in either of those 2 cases, in my experience, there's not much healing happening. And grief is fundamentally a healing process. It's healing our sense of separateness. Grief is the negative emotions that arise in response to feeling separate. And there's this great quote by Rumi. I'd like you to riff on it a little bit if you could. Grief can be the garden of compassion. Compassion has the quality of being connected. Grief has the quality of being separate. So this conscious grief work is working with grief and separation and transmuting it into connection and compassion. And in Tibetan Buddhism, they had this wonderful saying, this wonderful notion that compassion is a mixture of sadness and joy. You were talking about the sadness, but when your heart is open enough, there can be a joy that transcends happiness and sadness at the same time. So you're sad because of the human, messy loss, all that stuff, but you're joyful because you're there, you're present.
Yeah, I wrote a lot right after the crash about what my experiences were. And one of the things that I continually came back to was how I missed how open other people's hearts were when I would be around them. Because being so close to the crash, people just seeing me, seeing the pain in my eyes, opened their hearts. And that created a space of just presence, of people actively just being with their pain, no escaping, no running away. It was too big to run away from at that point. And there was a definite sweetness to that. I'm not a fan of joy for that word, but I found there was just this raw sweetness that when I would go to the store to buy a shirt and the lady working the till recognized me, and we both would just cry together, that all of a sudden the whole interest rates, the mortgage, your credit card bills, dinner that night, all melted away. Even the transaction that was happening would melt away. And there was just these 2 people just sharing pain together.
Right.
And there was a sweetness to that. Yeah. And I found even in the group work, when we would meet as a group, it was almost as if being in a group raised your capacity for being with your own pain. That having others share the same type of lived experience allowed us all to touch different levels of our pain that we individually couldn't go to.
Grief is very, very hard to heal on your own. That at the same time, for most people, their hearts are never so open as during deep grief. So it's in some way an incredible, horrible opportunity to touch parts of your heart that therapy and falling in love and whatever things you do to feel heartfelt aren't going to touch the way grief does. And one thing I really learned from Stephen Levine was that we think we're grieving because of something that just happened, but that something that just happened has uncovered all of our grief. So there's the grief of the bus crash. There's the grief of you being 3 years old when the puppy died, or 2 years old when your mother was too busy and you needed her, or on and on and on. I mean, we've all lost so much. Relationships, identities, people have died, people have left, people have disappointed. And some of that stuff is processed, but a lot of it's shoved down in to this reservoir of grief. And it really then limits our ability to connect with other people. And just the way you were painting that picture of being in this shop buying a shirt, and how it opened both of your hearts, right? They say that love is contagious. Those who haven't got it catch it from those who do. And there you were, wide open, ripped open and from this tragedy. And people could feel that openness. It touched their hearts. It opened them, even though you weren't even saying anything.
Yeah, I think, well, it's kind of two things I'd like to touch on. I mean, I always found the line from Stephen Levine that was one of my favorites was like, it's easier to deal with a 5-pound monkey or the 5-pound grief than the 500-pound gorilla or the 500-pound grief. And I almost question that. Like for me, I had been starting to work with embodied emotions just slightly before the crash, but I think I needed the 500-pound gorilla. I needed the big grief in my life to shake things up enough to start to look at the things that were below that, to start to work backwards into those childhood traumas, the conditioning of 0 to 3 to 7 years old. And I don't know if that 500-pound gorilla didn't beat the door down if I would have touched on that.
Right.
Yeah. And, I shouldn't have said I wanted to touch on two things because I forgot what the second thing was.
Do you feel some grief about that? See, to me, that's the 5-pound monkey. That the 500-pound gorilla has shown you there's work to do and it's knocked the door down. But you can't work with the 500-pound gorilla on a daily basis. It wouldn't leave energy for raising your kids and loving your wife and harvesting your crops and things like that. So that there's like so many little griefs happening moment to moment to moment. I've got an 81-year-old brain and I'm forgetting names a little bit. I'm not forgetting people, but it's like words aren't quite there. And at first I thought, there's like some emotion about that. And I've started to work with that 5-pound monkey of my brain doesn't do all the tricks, right? And it's like, it's really an ongoing process of, am I feeling separated from this moment? Am I feeling some grief that I'm not fully connected with Dale, with Critter, with life? And it was just feeling this separation, feeling the suffering that's inherent in that separation, and feeling mercy for that again and again and again. So that I get that probably for a lot of people, we get shocked into doing this work by the gorilla. But it's, to me, a lot of these practices, they come to us in kind of shocking ways. Like you meet Maharaji, or there's a bus crash or something that just changes your worldview. But that eventually that doesn't have to, but ideally it becomes a way of life, a moment to moment kind of dealing with loss, dealing with love, dealing with whatever. And even before, when you said that you didn't get that Tibetan quote about compassion being a mixture of sadness and joy, that you don't feel joy so much. To me, joy is maybe a tricky word, but it's just like there's this real openness that maybe it's sweetness, maybe it's joyfulness, maybe it's just space, but there's something that transcends happiness and sadness. There's something, so we realize that our heart is much vaster, that our being is much vaster than the emotions that are coming and going.
I like that. I was sitting with my Lama earlier this week, Sonia, and we were having a discussion on wholeness. And I said, at times, I don't feel safe when I'm feeling this wholeness. And she says, do you think safety is a quality of wholeness? And I found like that was one of the 5 pound, maybe a 25 pound grief, to just examine that and be like, oh, is there supposed to be this inherent safetiness that's there? Or is there supposed to be something else along with that? And when the preconception that I had that safety should be involved with wholeness was able to dissolve, that a lot more peacefulness, a lot more openness, a lot more spaciousness was able to happen, because my idea of wholeness was able to dissolve a little more, and I was actually able to just rest in it.
So one quote that's been really bouncing around in my brain lately that I really love, where the Buddha was talking about the Heart Sutra. The Heart Sutra is form is emptiness, emptiness is form. And he said, or maybe it wasn't the Buddha, maybe it was somebody, some super wise person. Forgive me for my lack of specificity here. But they said, if you're not startled and terrified by the Heart Sutra, you really don't understand it. It's like there is no place to stand. There is no safety. That the only safety is surrender, dying into this next moment without having any place to stand or knowing where you're going to land. Mm-hmm. Right. And so it's that metaphor that Ramdas had, which is so great. He said, spiritual life is like jumping out of an airplane and realizing the partway down you don't have on a parachute. But then a little further way down, you realize there's no ground. But that we find ourselves in this time between no parachute and there might be a ground, right? You're thinking the rocks might be coming up really quickly. There is no ground to bump into, but that's not a worldview. That's not the stance of the ego. The ego wants to understand, is based in the delusion of separateness and solidity.
Yeah, and I find too that for myself, the dissolving of the ideas of something permanent, like a heaven, that we've been taught in the Western world, that there's going to be this continuation and it will be that way for eternity, for all time, can be very sticky and can show up over and over again and try to re-solidify itself into even realizations, new beliefs, into many different things. And for me, I have to constantly be on top of that, realizing that okay, when I'm grasping for something that continues, when I'm grasping for something that is, we'll say solid, or that is eternal, I know that I'm starting to think there's a ground I'm going to fall into again.
So Critter is in a group that I facilitate. It's an ongoing group. And so he and I talk off and on about his practice. And earlier this year, he came to me and said that he couldn't practice anymore, that he'd been practicing meditating. He's really committed meditator. He's got a teacher. He goes to retreats, and he realized, and maybe you can say this a little more clearly than my fuzzy memory here, that he needed to go beyond that view of practice, if you will. And I've been going through that same thing too, where I was practicing out of a sense of needing to get somewhere. A lot of meditation teachers really patted me on the back and said, "You're a really great meditator. Go for it, kid." You know. And I worked and worked and worked, and I was still neurotic. I was still like, "What's going on here?" In a way. So I stopped meditating for a big chunk of time. And to me, it's now more, I appreciate meditation because it does calm my mind. It helps me to be more in the moment. But still, that's just a preference in a certain way. You know, to me, it's a lot about, it's at least as much about receiving as it is about giving, doing. And I used to think it's if I did it hard enough, I'd get there. Right. And now it's more like that even the pain of it, that Rumi poem where the guy is complaining to God, "Look, I've been praying and you don't ever say anything." And God says to him, the grief you feel because you're not feeling anything is the return message, right? That it's a kind of a real tantric view of things, that even this is it. And it's just exactly the way it is, which doesn't mean you don't become an activist or better at what you're doing or something. So what do you think about all those words?
Yeah, I know for myself for a long time that my practice was about escaping pain. It was a way that I thought I would end some level of pain, some level of discomfort, some level of not good enough. And it was like I tried, and I mean I tried. I would meditate in the sauna with the sauna cranked up, sit there for an hour. I'd do 10-day retreats, 100,000 mantra retreats, and sit there until your knees are on fire. Until I finally, what had to dissolve for me was that I'm not getting out of a world where there is no pain. There's pain here. There's physical pain. There's sadness. But what I can be free from is this illusion, these illusions that I'm creating for myself about the world and the way it is. And that when those illusions started to dissolve, my practice started to change, because for a while there was a lack of motivation then. It was like almost verged on the being nihilistic. It was like, well, what's the point? What's the point? I'm not going to claim that I've seen emptiness clearly, but there was some realization there where it's like, okay, I couldn't find a fixed self anymore inside me, inside anything else. And I'm like, well, what's the point of practice? Until I seen after a while, oh, this practice does help me be patient. It does help me be compassionate, kind, generous, loving. It helps me be more insightful. Oh, so there's, I mean, in Buddhism and Vajrayana Buddhism, there's the 6 paramitas and things that are twofold. Like you can realize emptiness, but you can fall off that side. Or you can work on all these 6 paramitas and become loving and generous and have deep insights into reality, but you can fall off that side too. So can we merge them? And it seems like when I had a motivation to merge those two, that all of a sudden my practice became not for me anymore. It became for the people I live with. And I'm not going to say for all beings. I think even that statement can be confusing and kind of throw people off it can mess up the mind a bit. But my practice became about my family and my coworkers and my people I live with in my community and the people on the Monday night group, that the more I do this, it allows a different Chris to show up, a different Critter to show up, and that affects everyone else I come across.
So my recollection is that part of what was going on there when you were pulling back from practice is that you were almost overwhelmed by fear of death. That one of your children had what could have been a life-threatening illness. It turned out not to be as bad as it could have been, thank God. But it shook something loose in you that really had deep reverberations. You want to say anything about that?
Yeah. My daughter ended up having osteomyelitis, which was a deep jawbone infection, and ate half her jawbone. And originally they thought it was jaw cancer. And coming out of that, it was about 14 months of having to realize I can't keep my family safe on some level. I mean, on some level I can. I'll teach them to not run into the street. And I mean, we live in an area that's populated with coyotes and wolves. I can teach them how to be careful around that, but I inherently can't keep them from dying. I can't keep my wife from dying. I can't keep myself from dying. I can't keep this yard and this farm from turning to dust one day. That everything I'm going to do at some point is going to disappear. And I had to face that, and not in a intellectual way anymore. I mean, I practice the Lam Rim, and you go through stages of the Lam Rim where you watch everything that you've created turn to dust. I had to actually live that. I had to feel that and realize that this is what's happening. This is reality.
So let me confess that I honestly think that being a farmer and being with the seasons is an advantage to realizing impermanence. Just as an example, we had 2 consecutive patients at the Dying Center in Santa Fe. The first one was the Rudolf Steiner teacher in Santa Fe. Rudolf Steiner, he's the guy that invented biodynamic gardening and Waldorf schools, and he was like a polymath, super smart guy. He thought he was an incarnation of Aristotle or Plato or somebody, I don't know. And so she was this like 40-year meditation teacher. And I thought, well, this is going to be really great to be around her. And I could barely go in the room with her. All of her wisdom was up in her head. And at the end of her life, she was really scared. And the next guy that came to the Dying Center was this guy who'd been a shepherd. He had tended sheep in the mountains in the Colorado, northern New Mexico border for many years. And he had watched animals die. He had watched them be born and the seasons change. And he had stomach cancer. He was near the end of his life. He wasn't afraid of death at all. He was familiar with it. One little story about him. I, back in those days, drank beer. And it seemed like my beer was disappearing faster than I seemed to be drinking it. One night I heard some noise down in the kitchen, and I went down in the dark, and there he was pouring a beer into his feeding tube. He couldn't even put it in his mouth. He had a tube where it was going right into his stomach. He didn't get to taste it, but he got the alcohol in the bloodstream at least. So maybe that's why he wasn't so afraid of death. I don't know. But sorry. Cough, cough.
Yeah, that reminds me of when my mom died. My mom died just a year after the bus crash. And I don't know between the crash and then, if I've ever been that present, when I would sit with her, and it wasn't like it was grieving son and dying mom at times. There was just 2 people just resting in love together, that we could sit there and hold hands. We could sit and watch the news. We could watch playoffs. Calgary lost to Colorado then. For anybody who's an NHL fan, you'll know what year I'm talking about. But we could just rest in that. And when my father and my sister would come over, they'd be like, "Oh, Mom's so high on medication, you guys don't know what you're talking about. You don't know what you're talking about, you guys." And it was like, we could just sit there. Okay, yeah, no problem, guys. No problem. And then shortly after she died, it reminds me of my first hospice client, who was a fellow who was terrified that he was dying. He was a woodworker. He worked at the Robin Hood flour mill his entire life. And when I went there, it was really his wife who wanted me there. She needed space away from him to get groceries. And I thought, I just helped. I was with my mom, and we had these beautiful moments, and I've been meditating, and I'm going to help this guy so much, and it's going to be great. And he hated me. He didn't want to talk to me the first 3 times. I just sat there in silence for an hour. Well, he'd just stare at me and growl, and he hated me until one day we talked about baseball. And when we started to talk about baseball, he softened and opened up, and he's like, "I like playing chess." And I was like, "Oh, I love chess." And it became so unspiritual that it was spiritual then.
So unspiritual and spiritual. I like that. I got to remember that one. That's kind of almost the definition of you.
Yeah.
Critter is somebody who proudly rolled 3 cars before he reached majority.
Yeah, they got the scars to prove it.
Okay. So what do you want to talk about now? I mean, I'm always excuse me, in this group we have, Critter tends to surprise me because his teacher, Sonia, says things to him that are very, very Vajra-like, very cutting. I mean, that like you're saying something, you're expecting a certain kind of answer, and the answer comes out of a 90-degree angle to where you expect it to be. It just like pushes you right over. I mean, she's really great in that way. And I've always been attracted to that kind of people. That's who Maharaji was. That's who Trungpa Rinpoche was. In a way, that's who Ram Dass was. I mean, in public, he talked the good talk, but in private, he was a very fiery, stern, loving kind of guy. And so Ramdas means servant of Ram, which is Hanuman, and Hanuman's an incarnation of Shiva. And my name, RamDev, means Ram's Lord, which is another incarnation of Shiva. So he was Shiva and I was Shiva, and we bumped into each other a lot. I mean, people think, oh, you're so lucky you got to live with Ramdas all those years. So it was not an easy thing to do. And I'm thinking that, but I've always been attracted to that. I mean, like my group, the group that Critter's in, is called Healing at the Edge. And you don't know what the edge is until you go beyond the edge a little bit, right? You fall over the edge. And to me, you live that same way in relationship teaching, where you want to find the edge. You want to really push what the edge is. And maybe, though, in that pushing, it's not coming from inadequacy or need anymore, but just curiosity and excitement in a good kind of way.
You know, as someone who struggled with addictions and has a good relationship with food, with alcohol, with drugs, with sex, video games, all those things. Like, I'm an addict for about anything. I'm an addict for excitement. I like to call myself a junkie for the Dharma, that even if I wanted to turn away from it, I can't. And I don't know why, but I am a sucker for reality. Even when it's painful, because normally it's not a sweet cup of tea. Normally looking at things the way they are is difficult. And that's why I like coming on Mondays. That's why I like going to see my Lama Sanya, because those like the Dharma teachings, like I like Manjushri's sword. Sword of Manjushri is a big flaming sword, and he uses it to cut through illusion. Well, when I cut through my own illusions with that, and I see myself, it's difficult. And I mean, Sonia does great work with me with simple things like, I think you compromise honesty for the outcomes. And like, oof, ouch. Or, yeah, samadhi or a non-dual experience is still just a moment in time. Doesn't make you that important.
Thank goodness.
Yeah. I mean, one of the first things she ever said to me was, so, oh, you had a spiritual moment? Oh, you took psychedelics and you had this great awakening? So what? Not a big deal. Go fuck yourself. And for me, it was like, whoa, it started to chip away at that part that was wanting to be special, was wanting to be important. And that started to break down that illusion that I wasn't, like, in equanimity, I'm not above it or below anyone else. It started to equalize and bring everyone to my highest version of what I imagine, or not what I imagine, but when I see things clearly, what we all are.
So I've been exploring, sometimes struggling, sometimes not struggling, with the balance between right effort and surrender. In a way, that's the leading edge of my practice now. I mean, when I try too hard, or when I try in some kind of self-deluded way, it's just getting in the way. But at the same time, I could just kind of float on the surface and not really be getting the juice. And so there's some very, this notion of right effort. It's a very subtle, important one. And more, to me, it's like there's an embodied feeling of spaciousness and open-heartedness that's always available. And yet I get lost in the world. I find the world so fucking interesting. It's like so exciting. One of my teachers, a long time ago, this Vipassana teacher, said, many people mistake excitement for happiness. Right. And just like you said, I'm kind of an excitement junkie. I used to drive motorcycles in a way that it's just God's grace that I'm still alive, actually. And so there's another kind of excitement that comes from being fully present. Maybe excitement isn't quite the right word. There's an aliveness. There's a connectedness. I'd just like to hear your take on any of that.
I mean, for me, what you're describing is kind of where I'm at in my practice now too, where I'm constantly telling myself, remember. It's almost like a basis for Tonglen for me, is like, I look at the world and I'm like, oh, we forgot. And when I see people, I'm like, oh, we forgot. They're lost in illusion. They're lost in separateness. They're not, I see people, and I mean, this is just a mind thing for me. And it opens my heart when I'm like, oh, God, we forgot. And then I pray and just pray, please remember. Please remember. When I do that, that spaciousness arrives. And to me, it has to be something like, if I don't do it daily, if it isn't something that is almost the background, then I forget. I get lost in excitement. I get lost in daily life and the bills, and it's going to rain soon. We got to get this field done. And I forget that I become ungrounded and uncentered, and I become fearful again. But if I constantly remind myself, remember, then yeah, that spaciousness arrives, and there's not a lot to worry about then. There's not a lot to fear.
So one final remark or question here. And we've talked about Manjushri's sword. We talked about being on the edge. We've talked about depth of practice and how strenuously or how deeply you were committed to meditation practice. And yet, my deepest sense of you is you're one big mushy heart. We don't have to tell anybody. We could keep that a secret just between you and me, right? But that somehow it seems like at the depth of your practice, it is about heart and love and compassion for other beings. I know that I used to be a scientist. I was like a almost a militaristic meditator, like, get out of the way, I'm going to the retreat now, or something like that. And the longer I go down the path, it's more about just remembering, like you said, remembering Maharaji, but really remembering that everybody's Maharaji. I mean, so many people in America right now, maybe you're lucky you're in Canada, people are freaked out about Biden and the debate and Trump and, hey, what's going to happen? You know, and I just have some feeling that it's all happening just the way it should. It's weird, it's unknown, it's curious, you can get upset about it, but one can also have this really devotional, loving quality with the mystery of how it's all unfolding. And there was one time in India, it's a whole long story, but the president of India came for darshan with Maharaji. He wasn't the prime minister, he was the president, which is not nearly as important, but he was the president of India. He came with all these followers and these cars, and they had all these presents for Maharaji. And as they were driving away, Maharaji said, all that fuss, and he's just a worldly king, right? So, I mean, it kind of reminded us that all this stuff is happening in the world, but that there's this heavenly king, or there's this relationship with something that's so much vaster than all of the story. And one can just kind of hang out there.
You know, it makes my heart sad at times when people talk about how terrible of a time we're living in. Because to me, it's like, look at how available the Dharma is now. I mean, in multiple ways. For those who aren't watching, I mean, I'm holding up my phone. I can go and find about any teaching I want in there. Even the quote unquote secret teachings, you search Google long enough, you'll find them. Mm-hmm. And they're available. Teachers are available. Teachings are available. Even the circumstances. That's another one. The circumstances that we're so afraid of, about Trump, about Biden, about Trudeau for us Canadians, and about Pierre Poilievre for the rest of us. Those are the perfect conditions for your awakening. And they're also the perfect conditions for you to push it away if you want to. And so to me, what a better time to be alive than when the Dharma is here. Reality is available. Interdependence can be seen, can be felt. Otherwise, I mean, they talk about the different kalas. There are times where there aren't Buddhas. There are times where there aren't teachings. And so I'd rather be here in this auspicious time where we can actually be junkies of the Dharma and really dive into it and learn to be free.
Truly an auspicious time. Would you like to say any parting words?
Yeah. You know, life is hard. You're not getting out of this one alive. You're going to grieve. You're going to lose. That's the nature of reality. But that doesn't mean we have to harden to it. It doesn't mean we have to be cruel to others. And one of my favorite things my wife and I say to each other when one of us isn't feeling good is, just because you don't feel good doesn't mean you need to be an ass today.
Lucky you.
So you get both sides of it there. You got the Chris answer and the Critter answer.
Well, thank you so much, Critter. I'll see you in a few days.
Yeah.
And it's been a real pleasure. It always is a pleasure to be with you.
Same.
I feel really glad that you're my friend, that we're going to go plunging forward in this on our lives together.
Amen.
Ram Ram. Lots of love.
Ram Ram.
Take care. Lots of love to everybody.